this is probably one of the most common reasons people reach out to me to work together, is trying to lose that last 10 to 15 that they're struggling with. And the reality is that they just have a arbitrary weight goal in their mind. There's no benefit to getting there. And there's actually probably harm at this point to getting there, because oftentimes they've been restricting for such a long period of time that that's caused negative impact on their metabolism. So most of the time when I work with a client who's in that space, our goal is, and if they're willing to work with me, because oftentimes they don't want to hear what I'm recommending, is you don't need to lose weight. You probably need to build muscle.
Welcome to Radical Vitality, a podcast dedicated to helping you find more health, joy, and radical vitality in body and mind, despite the challenges of modern life. I'm your host, Kanchan Koya, a PhD in biomedical sciences turned cookbook author, health and nutrition coach, and passionate advocate of the use of spices, functional foods, nutrition, and lifestyle for better health. Join me and top experts in women's health as we navigate what has become an all too complicated landscape when it comes to health and wellness, so we can get down to what really matters, so you can enjoy that life of radical vitality you so deserve. Now, on to today's episode. My guest today is Dr. Adrian Chavez, a PhD in nutrition and health promotion from Arizona State University. Dr. Chavez also has bachelor's and master's degrees in exercise science and over 7 years of experience working with over 1,000 clients, both in a one-on-one and group coaching format. Dr. Chavez has taught over 1,000 students through various online courses, and his Instagram page really caught my eye because it is extremely evidence-based, non-sensationalist, very practical and pragmatic, and really exactly what we need in today's often damaging world of extremist nutrition advice. Dr. Chavez's primary areas of expertise include general nutrition, metabolic health, including diabetes and insulin resistance, and cardiovascular health involving blood pressure, lipids, etc. We talk about common nutrition myths and misconceptions today about what the perfect diet really looks like, how to navigate all the complexities of the modern nutrition world to achieve optimal, immediate, and long-term health, weight loss, and so much more. You are going to leave extremely empowered with practical, actionable steps you can put into practice in your own life to enjoy nutrition and a life of radical vitality, which is what this podcast is about. So without further ado, on to today's episode with Dr. Adrian Chavez. All right, Dr. Adrian Chavez, welcome to Radical Vitality. So great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've been following you for a little while, and I feel like in this day and age of so much misinformation, I almost feel like we're in an unprecedented time of nutritional misinformation, especially given social media's arguably excessive influence on people's way of thinking. I found your message really refreshing, pragmatic, and sensible. So I really wanted to bring that message to my audience because I really feel like people are just genuinely confused. And if they go to your website, some of the things that you have on there really, I think, are what is needed today. Like, for example, science-based nutrition and health information you can trust. Trusted source of practical information in a world of fad diets and magic bullet supplements and on and on. And if people follow you on social media, which I'm sure they will after this conversation, they can really see why you are that sensible voice we so desperately need. So thank you for being the sensible, science-based voice and for debunking a lot of the fads and myths out there.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. That was a really great introduction about the things that I do, and to be honest, it came from working with people. It came from actually just trying to give people sensible dietary advice based on science. And you have a client that needs to lose weight, and I start to talk to them about the things that are going to be helpful, and they're like, "Well, I heard this, and then I heard this," and it was making my job a lot more difficult in actually working with people. And that was one of the reasons that I started creating some of the content that I do on social media. Is I just realized the need for it. And I could send my clients to my social media page and just be like, go see some of the stuff I put out there. And, you'll see why seed oils aren't killing you. And it's okay to have a Diet Coke every once in a while.
Ooh, yeah, that's the nitty gritty I want to get into. So before we do that, just taking a step back, that's interesting to hear that your interest in more sensible, practical nutrition arose because of your work with clients. But what kind of spurred your interest and curiosity in nutrition and led to your desire to pursue a PhD in nutrition in the first place?
Yeah, so my undergraduate and master's degrees were in exercise science, and that was my primary focus. I played basketball growing up, and I was interested in working in the athletic field, like training athletes and working with like high level athletes on that side of things. But I was always interested in nutrition as a part of performance and changing body composition and all of that. And I had my own health issues, some digestive issues that I ran into during grad school. And I made some modifications to my nutrition. I always knew nutrition mattered, but I was like more focused on it from a body composition perspective, from a performance perspective, like macros and calories for the most part. And when I had these digestive issues, went to the doctor. They told me that nutrition didn't really matter. They gave me medications. I made some changes to my nutrition because I didn't believe it. I was like, everything that I eat goes into my gut. It has to play a role. So I made some pretty major changes to my nutrition at that point, and they improved. Like all of my digestive issues like improved over the next couple of months. And that's when I decided like, okay, I've been focused on these things from a performance and athletic perspective, but the information that I've learned is really applicable to a health standpoint, like from a health point of view. And I got really interested in nutrition from that side of things. So I was getting a master's degree in exercise science. I had taken nutrition courses, but I didn't have a previous degree. I'd read tons of books at that point and a lot of misinformation. And that's where my entry into the field comes from, because I had a master's degree in exercise science, or I was getting a graduate degree in exercise science, and I was reading a lot of popular books. And I realized later on, once I started getting into formal education for nutrition, I had read a lot of information that was just very misleading during that time. And I had believed a lot of it myself during my early 20s, because although I had a pretty good, background in science, it's still very believable. A lot of this information is the way that it's presented, the way, the people that it's presented by, it can be very, very like persuasive in the way that a lot of these social media influencers, and back then it was a lot of New York Times bestselling authors and people who ran blogs. So I would read all these blogs and I would learn information about nutrition, and then I'd go, and once I actually started getting into formal education, I was like, oh wow, a lot of this is not accurate, and a lot of the things that I was being told or that I had read in these books is extremely misleading.
Hmm. Yeah, and your PhD also has a health promotion piece, which I found intriguing. So tell us a little bit about that. Is that sort of why? Because I feel like there's a lot of nutritionists out there and PhDs in nutrition, but you're really focused on bringing that science-based advice and actionable takeaways to the public. Is that something that you were kind of trained in, or was that a part of the program?
So the program, people can have different focuses, and ours was more focused on public health and health promotion overall. It wasn't like you don't go there to study, molecular pathways and things like that. It was more of a public health focused program. I actually did a postdoctoral fellowship in a public health setting. So I did that in the public health department at San Diego State University. So my focus was always the public health standpoint. Like how can we apply nutrition in a way to larger groups of people that can benefit, health? Because we see that from a population standpoint, increasing rates of diabetes, which is causing a burden on our healthcare system, and increasing rates of various, early health issues for a lot of people. And a lot of this has to do with nutrition, lifestyle, exercise, and the missing link. Like we know what people need to be doing for the most part. And there's definitely more research coming out that is helping to further our understanding of nutrition, but we know what people need to be doing. It's just a matter of how do we get people to do it. And that's the hard part. And a lot of times there's a disconnect between people with PhDs who understand the topic very well, and then being able to communicate that topic. So during my PhD, I ran nutrition education programs. So we were going into community centers and elementary schools in lower income areas, and we were running programs for parents and also doing like some exercise and a little bit of nutrition stuff with the kids too. But we were focusing mainly on the parents with the nutrition education in an attempt to change the children's habits and change the habits in the home and in the like home environment. And so that's the type of research that I was doing during my PhD. So that's why I have more of a practical aspect of nutrition, because I was running some of these classes at first. I was training other students to run these classes. So we were teaching at a very, lower grade level to be more accessible to larger groups of people who were on lower income, budgets. And so me telling people to, go organic and buy these certain, $7 tortilla chips isn't going to fly very well. It's more, practical advice that's going to be the thing that really moves the needle for these groups.
Yeah, there's so many great points you made there, and I want to double click on a couple of them and come back to it. One of them was this distinction between someone like myself, to be honest, who, has more of a molecular cancer biology background, not really a public health background. I'm very interested in public health now, but I'm not trained in it. And I have to kind of catch myself, because sometimes it's very easy to go down this path of like, these are the mechanisms at play, and this must mean it works this way in humans. And I think you've talked about this on one of your podcast episodes, which I really appreciated. Like, there's a distinction between science at a mechanistic level and then what actually happens in humans. And a lot of the misinformation out there that is harmful to people and fear mongering is based on these very isolated mechanistic studies in test tubes or animals, or high concentrations of certain plant compounds that wreak havoc in a cell. So it must be really bad for you. So I want to come back to that when we talk about some of the myths that really annoy you personally. But I'm glad you raised that point, because it's important that the people you are taking nutritional advice from, this is to everyone listening, not, is at least conscientious of the importance of how these things manifest in a human body versus every other kind of model system out there. And people can get really carried away with, some isolated mechanism stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In a human body, but beyond that, like a human being who has other things to take into account. Because a lot of people are giving they'll tell you to switch for this chips for this one. And it's like the difference between those two chips from a nutritional standpoint is marginal at best, but one of them costs 5 times as much. And so that advice is not holistic in nature, and taking into account the fact that it's going to put a financial strain on a lot of people to spend 3 times as much on chips, or 3 times as much on any product that offers marginal health benefit. And that's what unfortunately, a lot of well-meaning advice, people are trying to actually give, good advice, and they have the right intentions, but they're pushing people in a direction where you're having to spend a lot more money and not really get a benefit from it. So that's something that I try to focus on with my messaging, is really, what are the things that are really going to move the needle? Not switching, a certain type of chip, but understanding how many chips you're eating and how many calories that's contributing to your overall energy intake, and whether or not that's causing you to have excessive amount of calories.
Yeah, I'm going to remember that forever. The difference between a human body and a human being. Extremely important. So thanks for raising that. So I'm going to get right into the deep end, and I'm going to ask a question that I know you probably hate, but I'm just going to ask it because I think your answer is going to be really instructive. And that is, in your expert opinion, what is the best diet for health? And the reason I say health is because there are so many different things people are trying to optimize at any given point. Like, many people are very focused on healthy weight management or fat loss. We live in a time where that's a huge public health crisis. But that's not the only outcome to pay attention to, because long-term health also matters. So when taking into account overall health, long-term health, is there a single best diet for health? And if so, what is it?
Definitely not a single best diet for health. Probably seen me post about this before, and I'm sure this is why you asked this question. But for each individual, the diet and when we talk about health, like When we're looking at a diet for health, we want to look at the major things that tend to impact our health over the long run. So that's heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's disease. These are the main things. So cardiovascular health, metabolic health, our brain health, and then cancer just comes down to overall health of our body and luck a lot of times when it comes to that. But when we are talking about health, those are the things that we're looking at long term that are most likely going to lead to, earlier death or, significant morbidity later on in life. So we want to try to avoid those things as much as possible. So a diet that's going to help you do that is one that is going to provide you with the right amount of energy. I've talked about this many times. A lot of people get overly focused on calories and energy balance and all of those things, but it matters. It's not the end all be all when it comes to nutrition, but if you're consuming excessive amount of calories, that's going to have a negative effect on your metabolic health. That's going to lead to excess, fat deposition and excess, fat storage, and which can have a negative impact on your health. And so to a certain extent, we have to understand if you have a tendency to gain weight or if you have a tendency to be underweight, because there's negative health consequences with that as well. Understand your energy intake and really get a handle on that and make sure that you're eating the right amount of calories, because calories is energy. And that's why a lot of people will ask me why I use that terminology, because I want people to think about it differently, because people have a negative connotation with calories, and it's just energy, and we need a certain amount of energy to live. And you need to be eating the right amount and not too much, and that's how you fuel your body. And so really, that's one of the most important things when it comes to nutrition. And then outside of that, making sure that we're getting the right amount of micronutrients. We have our essential vitamins and minerals, just making sure that we're getting those. And if you're eating mostly unprocessed foods and you're eating a variety of foods and not following a restrictive diet, you're probably meeting most of your nutrient needs. Most people the average person's eating 60% of their diet from highly processed foods, which are oftentimes going to be lacking various micronutrients. And a lot of people are restricting their diet in various ways, which can also lead to various micronutrient deficiencies. So that's an important one as well. And I always recommend people just kind of pay attention to that. You can track that for a period of time. A lot of people ask me about that, like, can you do tests? There's a lot of companies selling tests for micronutrients to test your micronutrient levels. Those are not good ways to test your micronutrient levels, because they're giving an indication of levels in the blood, and that is not telling us what's going on in the tissues where those micronutrients are actually, having their activity and where it's important to have sufficient levels. So that's another, like, when it comes to nutrition, I always tell people, like, making sure that you're eating the right amount of energy, making sure that you're eating a diet that provides all of your essential micronutrients, and then one that, reduces your risk of chronic disease. And we know certain things are going to reduce your risk of chronic disease, like eating more fruits and vegetables, eating more nuts and seeds, eating more fiber overall, and minimizing your consumption of certain things like sodium, especially if it's causing you to have high blood pressure, and then minimizing consumption of something like saturated fat if it's causing you to have higher LDL cholesterol. So I mapped that out in a recent podcast episode. I know it's kind of complicated, but like, the perfect diet for you is the one that's providing you what your body needs. And all of our bodies need certain things, and you can be following a low carb diet and get all of that, or you can be following a vegetarian diet that's, very high carb and get everything that you need. So your dietary pattern can look very different and still meet all of your nutrient needs. The key is that you have to be following something that you can sustain over the long term, because a lot of people are focusing on, a perfect diet or trying to optimize everything, and they just can't stick with it. And it's not something that they're going to be able to maintain, and we're going to have to eat for the rest of our lives. So a lot of people, are looking for the 12-week plan or the 6-month plan, but nutrition is a lifetime thing. And so you really have to be looking at it from, what can I do for the rest of my life, and what works for me, and what's sustainable for me.
Yeah, I love that sensible advice. And if I were to summarize, what I heard you say is really the first thing is to eat enough calories, not too many and not too few. So to meet your energy needs. And I love that sort of taking the emotional aspect out of calories, because especially for women, it is such a charged term, but really it's like a metric of energy, and we need energy and the food provides the energy. So if we think about it that way, we can get a little bit less emotional about it, and more pragmatic about it. And then micronutrients, super key. Really important point you raised about biomarkers or measuring micronutrients, because often that is not really indicative of sort of whether you're getting enough into the tissues. So maybe tracking, like you said, and I want to talk about tracking in a second. And then third, the sustainability piece, the fact that people should be able to sustain whatever dietary pattern they're on. What about macros? So people are obsessed with calories, and calories matter and energy balance matters. We know that. But people are also kind of obsessed with macros. So, I mean, I can't tell you how often I go out with girlfriends here in New York City and I see people scared of certain macros. You know, some people are scared of, most people these days are scared of carbs. Many people are scared of fat. Some people are scared of animal products. I mean, it just goes on and on, the fear around certain foods. So, when you're coaching someone or working with someone and just trying to get them onto like a very basic, sensible health plan, how do you talk to them about macros?
So we focus on calories, like overall energy intake, and then protein, because it's important that you're eating enough protein for multiple reasons. A lot of people think of protein as just like for muscle building, but really protein is a building block for pretty much everything in our body. And we need to be eating enough protein. If you're not eating enough protein, that can negatively affect your immune system, your bone health, your tissue, like your ligament health, and more. And a lot of people don't realize that. I see a lot of times when I have conversations around protein, a lot of people think it's all about muscle building and bodybuilding, and really protein is just a building block for nearly everything in our body. So it's really important to make sure that you're eating enough protein. The other side of things is protein is very satiating. So it helps us stay full for a longer period of time. So making sure that you're getting some in each meal is important. So I'll have clients focus on getting enough protein. In general recommendations around that are 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now that can vary based on, what you're doing in terms of exercise. You can go all the way up to 1.6 or even higher than that. And so I have a podcast episode discussing this in a little bit more depth, but that's a, kind of basic recommendation, making sure that you're eating enough protein, eating enough calories. And then after that, the fat and carbohydrates really don't matter in terms of health or body composition. There's no evidence to demonstrate that going higher carb or going lower carb has any major advantages for body composition or health. You can lose body fat on a low carb diet. You can lose body fat on a high carb diet, as long as the calories and protein are at the level that you need to in order to be in an energy deficit. And so same thing with health. There's no indication that eating a lower carb or higher carb diet is going to be advantageous for long-term health. Again, the key is sustainability, and then what you're actually eating. What are those carbohydrates and fat? Is that fat oil from a fryer in a fast food restaurant, or is it healthy olive oil or some nuts or some olives or something along those lines? So the actual sources of fat and carbohydrates versus the amount of fat and carbohydrates is really the most important there, and making sure that you're eating carbohydrates that have high amounts of fiber, and then also when you're consuming fats, trying to limit your saturated fats from animal foods, and then just making sure that you're trying to get some nuts and seeds in there with your fat sources as well, because those are the evidence for benefits of consuming nuts and seeds is pretty substantial. Reduces risk of cancer, heart disease. Pretty much every chronic disease is reduced with more consumption of nuts and seeds.
Yeah, that's so sensible. That is refreshing because, oh my gosh, with the protein thing, I feel like there's a lot of interest in protein right now, and I'm happy about it because a lot of my audience is women in their 40s. We're losing muscle. We may not be resistance training with the same prioritization as we focus on other forms of exercise. And there was this notion for a while. I feel like we go through phases in nutrition conversations. The idea was, if you're just eating a balanced diet, you're getting enough protein, don't worry about protein. I will say, when I started tracking my calories and my protein. For how active I am, I was barely meeting my minimal protein needs, which were initially thought to be zero 0.8 grams per kilogram. And I think most experts would agree that's probably too low and more in the range of what you're talking about, 1.2 to 1.5, 1.6, depending on your goals, and is more appropriate. And so what are your thoughts on tracking? I am a huge fan of it for at least a little while, just because my own personal experience showed that it's very hard to kind of know where things are at without measuring them. And you don't have to be obsessive about it and you don't have to do it forever, but just doing it even for a couple of weeks can be pretty eye-opening. So is that something that you recommend? What's your kind of general stance on tracking calories, macros, and micronutrients?
Exactly what you just said. So doing it for 4 to 8 weeks, probably to get a handle on understanding your energy needs, understanding your intake, understanding where those sources of excess calories may be coming from. It also helps a lot of people to dial in on their snacking because a lot of people do a lot of mindless snacking. So if you track everything, it's really helpful. So I know there's a lot of negative connotation around tracking for a lot of people, but the reason, in my opinion, is because most people approach tracking in the wrong way. So they don't approach it as a tool to learn to build habits. So if you use tracking as a way to help you build habits, and this is something that I teach in the course that I have about so I have a course called Nutrition Mastery Blueprint, where I teach kind of how to track for a period of time and then build habits around that tracking, so that when you can take away the tracking and now you have these habits that are in place. Like, for example, for me, I can lose body fat if I want to and get down to pretty low levels of body fat without really tracking, because I understand what I need and I know what habits are necessary around that, like 600-ish calorie meals 4 times a day. If I do that, I will lose body fat. Like, for me, because I'm taller and very active, like that's a pretty big calorie deficit for me. And so I can do that pretty accurately without tracking because I've done it before in the past and I have an understanding of what that meal size looks like for me and how to construct a bunch of meals that are in that calorie range. And so using tracking as a way to learn how to construct your diet to meet your needs, I think is really, really helpful. A lot of people just start tracking and then they use tracking as a way to stay under some random calorie level. So they'll just set, I'm going to start tracking and eat less than 1,500 calories or 1,400 calories every day. And so they track to restrict, essentially. And that's not what it should be. It should be to learn how to fuel yourself appropriately with the right amount of calories, with the right amount of protein, to understand where your micronutrient deficiencies might be, because then you can look at your micronutrient intake over a period of a couple of weeks and see, okay, I'm not eating any vitamin A, I'm not getting enough zinc, maybe I can supplement with these, or maybe I can consume more zinc sources. Tracking is a really, really helpful learning tool. Unfortunately, so many people have, as you mentioned, just negative perceptions around tracking. And in my conversations and working with people, it's been largely because they've often done it as a restriction tool. And it's always, when they track, it's always, I'm trying to eat less calories than this amount. And there's no end date. It's just, I'm putting everything into an app so I eat less. And that's not the approach that I recommend.
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, I'm sure you've worked with women who, again, are just focused on restriction and fat loss without really having a reason why. I mean, often the reason is aesthetic, and I can, appreciate that everyone wants to look and feel their best. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that it can sometimes be taken too far. And how does one know when one has reached or one is at a healthy level of body fat, where the further pursuit of more body fat loss isn't really necessary for health, at least?
Yeah, so a lot of people are there who are trying to lose the last 10 or 15. Most people who are trying to lose the last 10 or 15 pounds are at the level where they're at their best health when it comes to fat. So fat, we have this negative association of fat equals bad, but fat is an organ in our body and it has an important function. Fat is actually an important organ for our metabolism. There's studies where they transplant fat into animals and it improves their metabolic health because fat is a storage depot for fat that would be otherwise circulating in our blood. So fat takes fat, like our fat cells take fat out of the blood and put it into storage so that it doesn't harm our health. And so the amount of fat that is necessary for it to start to have a negative effect on health varies dramatically from person to person, because it's largely dependent on the amount of fat cells that you have, and that's largely genetic, and also depends a lot on whether or not you gained a lot of weight during adolescence. So some people can be at very high body fat percentages and be perfectly healthy when it comes to metabolism, when it comes to cardiovascular health, because they have a lot of fat cells and they're functioning appropriately. It's when the fat cells become overfull, so you kind of fill up beyond what those individual cells can manage, and they start to dump fat into the bloodstream and start to release all these inflammatory cytokines. So a long answer to your question is, it depends on the person, but fat is not the determinant of health. And so when you want to evaluate your health, we want to look at actual health markers. So is your LDL cholesterol in a healthy range? Are your triglycerides in a healthy range? Is your HbA1c and fasting glucose in a healthy range? If all of those are healthy, you're probably not going to have much of a benefit from losing more body fat. And so that's, many people, we see these images of what is, quote unquote health on social media and on magazines and things like that. But the evidence demonstrates that when the body fat percentage that's associated with the longest lifespan for men is about 22%, which is much higher than all of these images we see. And in women is a little bit higher. It's like 31% or somewhere around there. And this is much higher than what we would expect and what we have been told about what a healthy body looks like. It's really like fat is not harmful to our health unless it's accompanied by metabolic dysfunction. And, and this depends on a lot of other factors. Like you can take two people, one has a much higher body fat percentage, but that person exercises, and the person who exercises is going to have better metabolic health, better cardiovascular health. They're going to have a longer expected lifespan than the person who doesn't exercise, who's at a lower body fat percentage. And so there's a lot more to it overall, and it's really difficult to give a specific number. But the reality is most people who are, trying to lose that last 10 to 15, there's no health value to that. And I can't tell you how many people I've worked with. This is probably one of the most common reasons people reach out to me to work together, is trying to lose that last 10 to 15 that they're struggling with. And the reality is that they just have a arbitrary weight goal in their mind. There's no benefit to getting there. And there's actually probably harm at this point to getting there, because oftentimes they've been restricting for such a long period of time that that's caused negative impact on their metabolism. So most of the time when I work with a client who's in that space, our goal is, and if they're willing to work with me, because oftentimes they don't want to hear what I'm recommending, is you don't need to lose weight. You probably need to build muscle, because most of the time, if you've been following lower calorie diets, and especially like weight cycling and going low calorie and then gaining it back, you're losing muscle when you go low calorie, and then when you gain it back, it's all body fat unless you're resistance training. And so people over time will they're at the same weight, but they've lost muscle and their metabolism's a little bit slower, and they have to eat even less calories to get to even maintain that current weight that they were at before, because they've cycled weight so much and they've lost a little bit of muscle mass. And so oftentimes those people feel stuck and they feel like their body's working against them and their metabolism's broken. But the reality is that they need to focus and take their body out of a state of restriction into a state of nourishment. And also they need to be resistance training so that they don't lose any muscle and they build up some muscle so that metabolism can be a little bit higher. Because as I just mentioned a second ago, if I eat 3,200 calories, I don't lose or gain weight. And that's because I've built some muscle and I'm active, but that's also because I've built some muscle. And someone else who's my same height, who doesn't have the same amount of muscle mass, will need less calories to maintain that same weight. So when you change your body composition, you can stay at that same weight and maintain it at a higher calorie level, and your body's going to be more nourished. And I know a lot of people say, I don't want to maintain the weight, I want to lose it. But if you go through this process, because I've seen it, it takes time. It takes 9 months, a year and a half. But when people go through this process and they see the way that their body composition changes, they realize that they weren't actually chasing a goal weight. They were looking for that improvement in the way that in their body composition, which didn't come down to losing more weight. It came down to building some muscle so that you can increase that definition.
This is such an empowering message, especially in a culture where, like you've said, many people come to you and it's just about losing those last 5, 10, 15 pounds, really vanity weight. And it causes a lot of stress for people. Women tend to restrict chronically, and often this leads to micronutrient restriction. People feel tired, depleted. They can't perform in their workouts. They can't perform in their life, and they're dissatisfied. And there's really no benefit to their health to lose those last 5 to 10 pounds. So this is super empowering and super important for people to hear. I had a question about protein. So we've established the importance of protein beyond just bodybuilding, but of course it's really important for muscle retention, muscle growth, especially as we age, and women going through perimenopause and menopause. There is this idea floating around in the longevity circles and the anti-aging circles that too much protein, again, going back to mechanism, it increases mTOR, which is a molecule that is sort of pro-aging. And so one of the secrets to aging less slowly is to actually eat less protein and to be a little bit lower protein in your dietary pattern. And then people turn to areas like the blue zones. I know you've talked about this in some of your podcasts as well, and I'll link to those podcast episodes in the show notes. But what are your thoughts on protein, longevity, aging, and this idea that lower protein cultures like the blue zones live longer because they're not eating that much animal protein or protein in general?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to the protein longevity argument, we don't have enough data to say anything conclusively there. That specific claim is based on one small study that is cherry picked in terms of the research. So that it's a older population who had lower lifespan, it was a younger population who was eating higher protein that had a lower lifespan, but the older population who was eating higher protein actually lived longer in that same study. And you hear the one side of it, because one of the guys who was an author on the paper, who's very popular, he is a proponent of a lower protein diet. And so he talks about the side of it where the younger individuals were eating high protein and they had a lower lifespan. But the other side of it was the older individuals actually benefited from the higher protein diet in that study. And it was a small study. I don't think it really adds too much to the overall literature. We don't have great data on, like, when we hear longevity, a lot of longevity comes down to genetics. When we look at the real 100-year-old people, and we see a lot of people talking about, longevity, how to reach 100. That's it. That extreme longevity is mostly genetic. I have multiple people in my family who have lived past 100, and they were not living healthy lifestyles, and not even close. And if you see, these things will cluster in families. And when you live in specific regions and those families never leave those regions, like what happens in the blue zones, part of that longevity is likely based on the genetics of the people of that region, and that's why they're living a little bit longer. So we have to not ignore that piece of it. When it comes to the protein intake of the individuals in the blue zones, it is lower. But I think that just speaks to the overall benefits of a more plant-based diet. And so I do think that higher animal, and the data demonstrates this, higher animal protein intake is, at best case scenario, not associated with any harm, but it's probably associated with slightly higher rates of heart disease, slightly shorter lifespan, etc. Now, when we look at plant protein intake, it's the opposite. So when we split protein by actual animal versus plant protein, that gives us a more detailed look into this story. And so I don't think that there's great evidence, because when we look at total protein intake and longevity, there's not really an association. But when we split them, there's a slight benefit from consuming more plant protein. There's a little bit of a negative effect on certain outcomes from consuming more animal protein. And so, the thought process there is just a more plant-based diet and consuming more of your proteins from plant foods is probably a good idea in terms of, protection against long-term health issues. And, if you're eating a high protein diet and you're getting a good portion of that from plant foods, I think that's probably the ideal approach. There isn't great evidence to demonstrate what you mentioned, like in terms of longevity, cancer rates. When we look at protein intake in all of the larger population studies, because this specific study that you're talking about was a smaller, very specific population. When we look at the larger studies, that relationship doesn't exist. And so when we see it in a small study, but then that relationship doesn't exist in all of the larger studies, I mean, we can probably say that this was maybe an anomaly, and there may be more to that, but yeah, I've been sent that study multiple times. And when I first read it, I'm like, okay, this is interesting, but discussing this study outside of the context of the fact that all the other research doesn't really support this is a bit misleading. And so someone saying that more protein equals, shorter lifespan or higher cancer, any of that, that's not supported by the body of research in this field.
Okay, so would in summary, would your recommendation then be, if someone is following an omnivorous dietary pattern, that they should focus on adequate protein and then focus on getting a lot of that protein from plant sources? And if they are getting it from animal sources, make sure it's not coming with a ton of saturated fat along for the ride, because that's going to lead to elevated markers of cardiovascular disease.
Exactly. That's perfect summary.
Right. And then, of course, if people are following exclusively plant-based diets, they might need to really focus on getting adequate protein. I have played around with exclusive plant-based diets for me and just found that it requires a little bit more preparation, planning, tracking, making sure, supplementation maybe with certain protein powders to make sure you're really covering your protein needs. But I think that's really important, because it's like we go through these phases, and now because everyone's fixated on protein, we've forgotten about cardiovascular disease and saturated fats impact. And people are like, it doesn't matter as long as your triglycerides are low, your LDL cholesterol can be high. And we know from so much literature that that's not the case. And your LDL cholesterol levels matter, and saturated fat does seem to impact those.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think most people can benefit from adding more plant protein. Like when I recommend people eat more protein, I'm typically recommending they add some plant protein to their diet, because you can just add it to your meals. Like add some beans, lentils to like almost every meal, and you're going to get 20, 30 grams throughout the day of additional protein from plant sources, and add some fiber to that as well.
Yeah, so I was going to say, what are some of your favorite plant-based protein sources? You mentioned beans and lentils. Any other favorites?
So my son's vegetarian, so I'm using beans and lentils and tofu in pretty much every meal for the most part.
Did he choose to be vegetarian? How old is he?
Yes, he just turned 10 a couple of days ago. He's been vegetarian since he was 4. And I think it was Thanksgiving, because it was right after Thanksgiving. And he, I think he saw the turkey. And he had always, I had explained to him like what he was eating, because he had asked me about it. And like, what's this? Chicken. I'm like, oh, it's chicken. Like, this is what it is. Yeah, and he decided that he wasn't going to eat meat. He hasn't in like 6 years. I think he has once since then, but yeah, he's been 6 years strong, and I don't see him ever changing. He's like an animal lover to the extreme, though. Like if he sees a beetle outside, he's like, oh, it's so cute, and like we can't kill insects and things like that. So I don't see him ever changing. So that's been a challenge for me, is like making sure, like you said, I just have to plan his diet a little bit better than I would otherwise, because it's a little bit easier to make sure that he's getting enough protein. And when a child is growing, a lot of the nutrients that they need more of tend to be more concentrated in animal foods. And so it's just, you have to be a little bit more intentional about things for a kid who's growing, who's deciding not to eat animal foods. He does have milk and eggs, so
Mm-hmm. He's not vegan, he's vegetarian, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit easier for me that way because I can, meet some of his nutrient needs to do that. But I do give him a supplement and, I'm diligent about his protein intake. As I just mentioned, I'm putting lentils or beans or tofu and usually a combination of those in almost all of his meals.
Yeah, one of the concerns people often raise, again, in the two camps, because everything has to be a tribal war for some reason, I don't know why, but is plant-based protein is incomplete and like it's not enough to just eat lentils, it's less bioavailable. Is there any real merit to those claims?
There is some merit to those claims. So on a gram by gram basis, animal protein is going to be more beneficial for meeting our amino acid needs because animal protein is going to have all of the essential amino acids contained within it. It's going to have high concentrations of especially the ones that are important for tissue growth and repair. However, if you're eating enough plant protein, there seems to be like a certain point where if you're eating enough total protein, you're getting all of the amino acids that you need. And so if you're going along the recommendations that we discussed earlier, where you're eating like 1.2, 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight, then that's where these differences in protein quality make there's less of an issue there because you're getting enough total amino acids that can be used for the various needs throughout the body.
Okay, incredible. There is this idea that you have to eat 30 grams of protein in your first meal, or else you will lose muscle, or I don't know, the sky is going to fall apart. I mean, is there merit to that claim? Like, how do you
No,
know?
definitely not. It's just helpful for a lot of people to eat a lot of protein in their breakfast. It's going to keep you full longer. So that's why some of these things that people recommend, they're practical tips, but they're not anything special. If you eat more protein in your breakfast, you're going to be full longer, and it's going to help you, move towards your protein needs for the day more easily. And because a lot of people end up, they're at dinner and they're just haven't eaten enough protein in the day. So I typically recommend people front load their water and their protein intake, like try to get as much as you can early in the day, because oftentimes when the day gets going, it sometimes gets a little bit harder to meet those needs. So if you can, get a lot of protein in your breakfast, that's always a good thing.
Love that. So you mentioned when we were talking about tracking macros, how it's important to track calories and protein, and the fats and the carbs don't matter hugely as long as the sources are good. Something that I'm sure you've seen on social media a lot is this issue of blood sugar spikes from carbohydrate rich foods. A lot of blood sugar stabilization hacks, and oatmeal will spike your blood sugar, so it's bad for you. And I have to say, just someone who follows the literature and knows what the benefits of some of these foods are, it really makes me kind of feel sad for the people who are giving up like on certain really health promoting foods because they're worried about blood sugar spikes. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have a metabolic health problem in the population, and a lot of people have prediabetes or diabetes and are unable to process incoming sugars even from healthy foods. But what are your thoughts about blood sugar spikes, especially from healthy carbohydrate rich foods, and should we be worried about that?
Yeah, definitely. So blood sugar is supposed to go up after we eat carbohydrate rich foods. So this is something that social media has turned into something that we're afraid of, and that they've turned into making it seem like a disease. But when you look at people who are showing those blood sugar charts, the red zone is a 30 milligram per deciliter increase in blood sugar. That's a marginal increase. Like blood sugar is supposed to go up that much and more after we eat. Now, what's not supposed to happen is our blood sugar stays elevated throughout the day and is elevated when we're fasting. Now, that's going to depend largely on your overall energy intake, and then also your activity level and your metabolic health. And so blood sugar going up after a meal, if you ate oatmeal, that's not a big deal. If it stayed up and it's up when you wake up in the morning and you have high fasting blood glucose, and your blood sugar after 2.5 hours after you ate is still high, then that's a problem. And that'll show up if you do an HbA1c test. So most people are getting, when you go to your doctor and you get your annual physical, I know most people aren't getting that, but if you do go to your doctor, most people should be getting it. If you do go to your doctor and you get your HbA1c test, done that will tell you whether or not your blood sugar is staying consistently elevated. These blood glucose monitors are just telling us that we're eating carbs. It's going to go up after you eat carbohydrates. Now, if you have a metabolic health issue, then that needs to be addressed with lifestyle habits, like improving your exercise habits and reducing your overall energy intake, improving your fiber intake, for example. These overall lifestyle habits are going to help you to improve your metabolic health. You don't need a blood glucose monitor to tell you what foods to eat. And what they often do, as you mentioned, is they move people from eating carbohydrate rich foods to eating more fat rich foods. So they drive, and this is one of the reasons they became popular, is because they just validate low carb diets. So a lot of people who promote low carbohydrate diets promoted blood glucose monitors because they said, look, if you wear this monitor, this diet shows you how great, or this monitor shows you how great this diet is, because it pushes people towards lower carbohydrate, higher fat diets. But unfortunately, when you eat higher fat diet, then you have your blood triglycerides go up. And that's just as harmful as blood glucose going up if your blood triglycerides are consistently elevated. So it's energy is going to be transported in your system. Triglycerides is fat, and glucose are carbohydrates. They're going to be transported in your system. Triglycerides and blood glucose are going to go up after you eat a meal. As long as the things that you're eating are nutritious and they're meeting your nutrient needs and you're not overeating, those acute fluctuations in blood glucose are not something to worry about.
So I have heard anecdotally from people, and then I think I saw one study that was observational looking at these blood glucose spikes from something healthy like oatmeal and then a subsequent crash. You'll often hear people say, you get a spike, then you get a crash, then you're hangry. And I know anecdotally some people will say that they need to add either protein or fat to that carbohydrate to not feel that crash, because otherwise they feel hungry 2 hours later. Do you think there's some bio-individuality to that, sort of how people respond to some of these blood sugar rises that are normal, but then how their appetite is affected from that,
Definitely. And there's bio-individuality to the blood sugar response. So some people they'll have a much higher increase from oatmeal than others will. But what you mentioned, the adding the fiber and adding the fat and protein to the meals, that's what I've been recommending forever. That's just going to give you a balanced meal that's satiating, and so that's important from a meeting your nutrient needs standpoint, and also just being satiated from the meal, as opposed to avoiding a blood sugar spike. So it's funny. I mean, it's a lot of the same advice, and it's a lot of people say, well, because I've talked about this topic before, and people say, oh, well, this person's giving a lot of the same advice that you are. And I'm like, yes, but they're causing people to hyper focus on this particular outcome and then avoid certain foods based on this. And it doesn't make sense to avoid oatmeal. Now, it does make sense if you find that you eat oatmeal and you get hungry afterwards and it doesn't keep you full, then that may not be the best choice for you. But, it's not going to be dependent on your blood sugar spike, and you don't need a blood glucose monitor to determine that. You can determine that just by eating oatmeal and seeing how you feel. And I actually don't feel like I get too full from oatmeal personally, but when I do put enough, like I put plenty of protein in there and some fat sources and things, like it can keep me full for a very long period of time when I do it that way. But what a lot of people are doing is they're eating, the oatmeal, and they're feeling full or feeling hungry afterwards, and it's 200 calories. And that's why it's an issue, is because it's not enough overall energy, number one. And so, yes, you're going to feel full 2 hours after you eat oatmeal because it was only 200 calories. And so if you add some type of protein on the side, some type of fat, and you make that a full meal, because most people need to be eating, the average person needs to be eating about 500 calories per meal or more. The average woman needs to be eating about 500 calories per meal. Men need to be eating higher than that on average. And most women aren't. And most women, when you show them a 500 calorie meal, they're like, oh, that's a lot of food. And it's like, that's how much you should be eating. Most people when they're trying to eat healthier, they're under eating typically. And then that leads to overeating on the unhealthy foods. And it's like, you need to be eating enough of the healthy foods, and then you don't have that desire to overeat on the less healthy foods.
How do you help a woman decide how many calories a day she should eat if she is someone who's tracking and paying attention?
If they're working with me, I can kind of tell them based on just the information that they tell me, and I just give them a starting point. There's a website called NIH Body Weight Planner. So if you type that into Google, it's run by the federal government. It's probably the most accurate website online that will give you, if you put in your age, your activity level, your height, and it'll give you how many calories you need to lose weight, to gain weight, to stay at your weight currently. And that's one of the most accurate ways. All of these are equations, so it's a good starting point, but it may not be accurate based on some individual characteristics of yours. But that's the best way, and you just kind of get a good starting point. You start tracking. I forgot to mention this a second ago, and I think it's important to mention now. If you're going to track, it is only helpful if you're very accurate with it. Because a lot of people, I can't tell you how many people I've seen who will say, I tracked for this period of time and it didn't work for me. And I'm like, did you measure your food? And they're like, no, I didn't measure my food. I just guessed. And I'm like, well, then it's not going to be accurate. And then I'm like, did you put everything into the app, or did you, snack here and there and you didn't add those in? And did you skip days, and so it's really important if you're going to track to do it accurately so that you get the right information. Because a lot of people just really drive themselves nuts tracking inaccurately and then thinking that their body's broken because you think you're eating 1,400 calories per day and you're not losing weight, but the reality is you're eating 2,000 because you're not tracking accurately. So it's really important to track your food accurately if you are going to do that, and that's to avoid some of that frustration and really get that learning from it.
Great tips. Okay, I know we have a little bit of time left and I have so many questions, so we might have to do a part 2. This has been so great. I have to ask 2 questions about 2 very popular, I would say, trends, or I don't know, things that people talk about, and just like, yay or nay, or just your quick thoughts. So one is intermittent fasting. What are your thoughts? Is it the magic bullet that many people say it is? I do practice it and I've talked about it, but I won't say what I think, but what do you think about intermittent fasting as the magic bullet?
Intermittent fasting can just help you eat less calories. And it also, in my opinion, I think it helps people regulate their hunger better if you don't overdo it. Because when you go long periods of time without eating, you're able to go long periods of time without eating. Like your body kind of learns how to do it. So I've done plenty of intermittent fasting, and I feel like that helps me regulate my hunger better when I'm eating in a normal, like I don't get that hungry between meals because I've used to going longer periods of time between meals. And then I can also, like if I'm traveling, I can go longer without eating and I don't have to feel like I need to eat and get low blood sugar type thing. So I think in my opinion, there's no evidence that it's like better for health or there's any specific health benefits to intermittent fasting or when we equate calories. So there are a lot of benefits to intermittent fasting, but when we compare it to someone who's losing weight without fasting, the benefits are the same. So you'll hear people talk about the benefits of intermittent fasting, but that's largely tied to the benefits of weight loss because they're restricting their calories. And when we compare that to people who are restricting their calories but are not fasting, the outcomes are the same. But I do think that there's some behavioral benefits to it that can help some people. But I've also seen the other side where people fast too much and they go through these crazy, fasting a lot and then binging a lot cycles. And I don't recommend that. So I think fasting is a good tool. It can help you eat a little bit less calories and then also just help you. I mean, it's just easier. Instead of eating, you don't have to eat and you skip a meal. So it gives you a little bit of time. So I think it works a lot for busy professionals and certain people. So I think it's a really good tool and a really good strategy, but there's no major magical health benefits to doing it. And it's not something that people have to do in order to be healthy.
Do you buy the autophagy claims that it's like if you fast for 16, 18, 24 hours, your body is in this autophagy mode and clearing out like senescent cells? Not enough evidence for that.
So it's doing that, but it's doing that if you're in a calorie deficit too. So your body's going into a very high level of autophagy during that short period of time, but then you're eating a lot and it's completely shutting that off when you're eating. If you're in a calorie deficit, your body's in a little bit increased autophagy all day. And so it's the same it's still occurring when you're in a calorie deficit. Autophagy is completely based on caloric intake as opposed to going long periods of time. It's just that signal goes really high because caloric intake the calories are so restricted during that short period of time. And that's where some of those claims come from.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the final trend that I would love your opinion on is, gosh, I don't even know if is a trend anymore. It feels like pretty entrenched in a lot of people's lives, is collagen supplements. And I know you posted on this recently. You have a blog post on this recently, which I will link in the show notes. Should women be investing in collagen supplements?
If you're consuming enough protein already from your diet, and so you're getting that at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein, and you have the money to invest, it's not a financial burden for you. I think a collagen supplement, using that, there could be some benefits based on the literature. So there's a little bit of evidence showing that it can help with skin elasticity. There's a little bit of evidence to show that it can help with osteoarthritis symptoms. And so for those reasons, I think that it can be helpful if you're consuming enough protein already. Collagen is a protein source, but it's not a protein source that's going to help with a lot of the things that we discussed earlier in terms of muscle building and immune function, because the specific proteins that come in collagen, they're not used for those. The specific amino acids that come in collagen aren't going to be used for those functions. So we want to make sure that we're getting enough protein for our important physiological functions first. And so if you're getting that, 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein through your diet, through plant and animal sources, and you want to supplement with some additional collagen, I think that there's not much risk to it, and there's probably some minor benefit to it if you're doing that over the long term.
Okay, great. So like I said, I think we'll have to do a part 2 because I have loads of questions, but I can't thank you enough for coming on. I have learned so much. I know my audience has as well. Where can people find you, and what are you working on or putting out into the world right now that people can look for that they would find helpful?
Yeah, so I have a podcast. So I have a podcast called the Nutrition Science Podcast. I started that earlier this year. That is doing really well right now. It's growing, and I'm really excited about it. I try to cover, as we discussed, like I have a full episode on saturated fat, a full episode on fiber. So what I try to do is just really get into detail about specific topics rather than bring on a bunch of guests talking about the same thing over and over again. I try to make it a library of information so that people can go there. If they have questions, they can, search fiber and find information about fiber. So I highly recommend checking that out. That's a really good place to go. And then right now, I just released a course. It's called Nutrition Mastery Blueprint. It goes over basically everything I think that people need to know in order to get started, in order to build, a healthy dietary approach and a healthy dietary plan that kind of works for you, that follows all the guidelines that we discussed. And after that, I'm working on a few other courses, one on blood pressure, one on cholesterol, one on blood sugar control as well. So my goal is for early 2024 to have a suite of courses on nutrition for these various health issues, because I keep getting questions about them. And I really want to be able to point people in the right direction and say, hey, look, if you want to reduce your LDL cholesterol with nutrition, I put this course together that's going to have all the information, resources, and tools you need to be able to do that, because the science is there. It's just a matter of getting it into people's hands. And I feel like when it comes to nutrition, it's just not getting into people's hands. And someone will get diagnosed with high cholesterol, and then they go online and search and end up doing a lot of the wrong things. They go keto and carnivore and worsen the whole situation. So my goal is to really provide that comprehensive source where, if someone gets diagnosed with high cholesterol, they can be sent to my course and have everything that they need to really manage it properly.
Great. We will link to all those courses and offerings in the show notes, and can't wait to see, what you do next. Really appreciate your voice of reason, pragmatism, sensibility, and just great advice that is very actionable and practical for the everyday person who is just trying to do their best. So thank you for everything you do, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Vitality podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. It's also the best way to support the show at no cost to you. If you'd like to share your thoughts or feedback, let me know by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite listening app or leaving me a comment on YouTube. Until next time, stay spicy, stay healthy.